The Dark Scrolls. The faded pages whisper of an empire at the height of its dominion, a kingdom wrapped in smoke from the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and draped in banners proclaiming its reach across continents. Yet beneath that spectacle of steel and conquest, the center of power trembled with a quieter, more intimate terror. The dread of a woman who was expected not only to rule a nation, but to endure the ancient sentence of pain that accompanied childbirth. Her name was Victoria, and though history remembers her as the sovereign matriarch of the British Empire, within the private chambers of the palace, she was a prisoner of her own body, bound to the relentless rhythm of conception and birth. She was crowned young, inheriting not only the throne, but the immense expectation of producing heirs who would secure the dynasty. The 19th century placed a peculiar burden upon monarchs, to be symbols of stability in a world reshaped by revolutions, industrial upheavals, and theological debates. 'Tis. For a queen, the obligation carried a harsher edge, for her reign would be measured not only in decrees and treaties, but in the number of children who emerged from her womb. Victoria, though fiercely intelligent and commanding in public, carried into her private writings a despair that grew with each pregnancy. She confessed in her journals that she dreaded the cycle of swollen months, the tearing agony of labor, and the endless confinement that followed. These words, hidden for decades, painted a portrait not of majesty, but of a woman shackled to nature's demand. When she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, their union was celebrated as one of love as well as politics. Yet even love became entwined with suffering, for almost immediately the pregnancies began. 9 children would be born over 17 years, a near-constant state of gestation that robbed Victoria of the control she so jealously guarded in matters of state. In the eyes of her ministers, she remained the sovereign, but in her own perception, she was little more than a vessel, trapped in cycles of pain. She called the process the shadow over marriage, and though Albert remained devoted, she sometimes spoke of resenting him for the inevitability of what followed their intimacies. The atmosphere of the palace during these confinements was one of both anticipation and fear. Each labor carried risks well known to the women of the time: hemorrhage, infection, exhaustion, or the cruel possibility of death. Physicians stood ready, though their instruments were crude, their knowledge limited. The Queen's cries, muffled behind heavy curtains, reminded courtiers that even sovereign flesh could be torn by the same fate as common women. The nation rejoiced when another child was announced, but those inside the chamber knew the cost was measured in tears and blood. By her 3rd or 4th confinement, Victoria's fear had hardened into something closer to obsession. She loathed the loss of dignity, the spectacle of attendants and doctors surrounding her bed while she lay helpless. She recorded her horror at the indignities of the body, describing the process as degrading and monstrous. To govern an empire with an iron will was one matter. To surrender to the primal torment of labor was quite another. It became for her a personal battlefield, invisible to her subjects, yet more terrifying than any political storm. In the mid-19th century, debates swirled in both medical and religious circles regarding pain, suffering, and divine decree. The Christian scriptures had long been invoked to justify the inevitability of labor's torment, citing the ancient words, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." To many, to relieve that sorrow was to defy the will of heaven. Even among physicians, the notion of dulling the senses during childbirth was considered radical, perhaps even dangerous. The era of anesthesia was just dawning, and substances like ether and chloroform were whispered about in both awe and suspicion. Some saw them as modern miracles. Others regarded them as poisons that tampered with the natural order. It was into this uncertain climate that Victoria's desperation converged with innovation. In 1853, heavily pregnant once more, she faced the ordeal of bringing forth her 8th child. The physician, John Snow, a man already experimenting with the measured use of chloroform, was summoned. He had studied the substance with care, observing how it could render patients insensible to pain without necessarily destroying consciousness. For the Queen, who dreaded the agony more than the risk, his presence was a beacon. The chamber was prepared in secrecy. Few were to know the details, for to admit that the sovereign had embraced such an experimental remedy might provoke scandal. As the contractions deepened and the cries rose, Snow administered the vapor through a handkerchief. Victoria inhaled, and within moments, the sharp edge of torment received, dead into a haze. For the first time, she endured delivery without the full fury of pain that had haunted her for years. When the child, Prince Leopold, was placed beside her, the Queen's relief was so profound that she called the experience soothing, delightful beyond measure. Her words, preserved in private notes, reveal a woman astonished by the possibility that suffering was not inevitable. In that instant, she crossed a threshold that countless women before her had never been permitted to approach. But the world beyond the chamber was less forgiving. Rumors escaped, whispers that the Queen had submitted to the new drug. Theologians bristled, citing scripture to condemn what they saw as rebellion against divine law. Some physicians condemned Snow's methods as reckless, insisting that chloroform might corrupt the blood, suffocate the lungs, or even kill both mother and child. The idea that the monarch herself had sanctioned such practice inflamed the debate, turning medical theory into a matter of national controversy. Victoria's stature, however, shielded the practice from total rejection. What was scandal in the mouths of clergymen became fashion in the parlors of the elite. If the Queen herself had embraced chloroform, how could it be denied to others? Soon, women of privilege began to request it, and gradually its use spread, though never without opposition. In this way, the private agony of one woman altered the course of medical history, dragging childbirth out of the realm of biblical punishment and into the domain of science. Yet the Queen's own feelings about the matter were tangled. She did not publicly champion chloroform, nor did she demand it become universal. Her attitude remained cautious, even secretive, perhaps aware of the storm it had caused. The paradox is striking. She had experienced relief so profound it felt like salvation. And yet she never fully claimed the role of reformer. Instead, the story of her chloroform births became another, air of the mystique surrounding her reign, half concealed, half celebrated, always disputed. In the years that followed, she continued to bear children, continued to express her distaste for pregnancy, and continued to seek control over the uncontrollable. Her private correspondence betrays a mixture of resignation and resentment. Though she adored her children once they were grown, she described the act of bringing them forth as a torment she would have gladly avoided. Her body bore the scars of repeated confinements, and her spirit carried the weight of dread each time the cycle began anew. Thus, the reign of Victoria, often remembered as a period of industrial triumph and imperial grandeur, contained within it a hidden narrative of bodily struggle. Behind the facade of iron will and maternal symbolism lay a woman who viewed motherhood less as a blessing than as a recurring ordeal. The juxtaposition of her public image as mother of the nation with her private lamentations creates a dissonance that historians still puzzle over. Was she a hypocrite, masking her loathing behind duty? Or was she simply honest, unwilling to sanctify suffering as her society demanded? The controversies surrounding her use of chloroform reveal much about the tension of the age. It was an era in which science began to chip away at the authority of Scripture, where the natural order could be manipulated by chemicals and machines, and where even the sacred experience of birth could be reimagined as a medical procedure. For some, this was liberation. For others, it was blasphemy. Victoria stood at the center of this conflict, not by design, but by necessity. Her fear drove her to embrace the new, and her status ensured that the new could not be ignored. Over time, the storm subsided, and anesthesia in childbirth became accepted, even expected. The Queen's role in that transition remained a point of debate. Some hailed her as a pioneer, others as a reluctant participant, still others as a symbol of decadence. The truth lies, perhaps, in the ambiguity. She was neither revolutionary nor reactionary, but a woman caught between faith and science, between duty and dread. As the decades rolled on and her children married into the royal houses of Europe, Victoria acquired the title Grandmother of the Continent. Yet the lineage she spread so widely was born of labors she considered dreadful. The irony is sharp. The matriarch of nations despised the very process that made her matriarchal. That contradiction lingers like the faint scent of chloroform itself, elusive, controversial, unforgettable. In the dark recesses of the archives, where her journals are preserved, the ink tells its tale with unflinching honesty. One sees not only the sovereign but the sufferer, not only the queen but the woman bound by flesh. The empire celebrated her as a symbol of endurance, yet her own words speak of torment, despair, and relief found only in the chemical mist that outraged priests and frightened doctors. To read them is to step into the shadowed chamber where history and humanity collided, and where a monarch's cry was silenced not by divine decree, but by the breath of modern science. Her story reminds us that beneath crowns and scepters, beneath banners and proclamations, there is always the raw pulse of mortality. Victoria's reign stretched across continents, but her private war was fought within the walls of her body, 9 times over, each battle etched in blood and memory. In the end, her legacy is not only that of an empire, but of a woman who dared, for a moment, to defy the ancient curse and to glimpse a world where suffering need not be sanctified. The palace corridors held their silence as though aware that what had transpired inside the Queen's chamber was both miraculous and forbidden. Chloroform had dulled the cries of a sovereign, and though the healthy birth of a child was celebrated with the usual fanfare, a quieter murmur spread among courtiers and physicians alike. Something unnatural had taken place. A line had been crossed, invisible yet undeniable, and those who caught wind of it could not decide whether to be awed or horrified. The reaction beyond the palace walls revealed the cultural fault lines of mid-Victorian Britain. At a time when industrial progress was hailed as the triumph of human ingenuity, the body remained sacred territory, bound by scripture and centuries of tradition. To interfere with the ordained suffering of labor was, in the minds of many, to rewrite divine law. Clergymen spoke with a tone of warning, invoking the ancient curse placed upon Eve and passed down to every daughter of humanity. They argued that pain in childbirth was not a misfortune to be avoided, but a spiritual burden to be embraced. For the queen of all people to abandon that burden suggested arrogance before God. The debate spilled into pamphlets, sermons, and newspapers. Some defended the practice as an act of mercy, consistent with Christian compassion. Others thundered that it was a violation of sacred command. Ordinary women listened, some with envy, others with suspicion. The thought that agony might not be inevitable was intoxicating, yet to claim that possibility was to risk censure. That their monarch had tasted such relief made the controversy unavoidable, for her choices inevitably echoed through the lives of her subjects. In the privacy of her journal, Victoria remained unrepentant. She spoke of chloroform as though it were a gift, marveling at how it had transformed the most dreaded ordeal into something almost bearable. Yet she wrote with discretion, aware that too bold a declaration would only inflame her critics. This secrecy shrouded her role in ambiguity, leaving future generations to wonder whether she was a pioneer, a patient, or simply a desperate woman clinging to any respite offered. Prince Albert, ever pragmatic, supported her decision. His correspondence reveals a man concerned, above all, with her safety and well-being. He viewed the use of chloroform not as rebellion but as prudence, another instance of science aiding humanity's struggle against suffering. His stance, however, did little to quiet the storm. For those opposed, Albert's rationalism only confirmed their suspicion that foreign ideas and modern philosophies were corroding the moral fabric of the nation. The controversy grew sharper when, 3 years later, Victoria again accepted chloroform during the birth of her 9th child, Princess Beatrice. This repetition signaled that the first experience had not been a passing experiment, but a deliberate choice. It gave weight to those who claimed that the Queen was legitimizing an unholy practice. Yet, it also emboldened physicians who wished to explore anesthesia further. The royal example, even when whispered rather than proclaimed, offered them a shield against accusations of recklessness. The medical profession itself was divided. Some practitioners saw in chloroform the future of humane medicine, a tool that could rescue patients from needless torment. Others warned of fatal complications, citing cases where careless administration had suffocated the vulnerable. The absence of standardized methods made these fears credible, and every death on the operating table was seized upon by critics as evidence that the drug was a curse, not a cure. Victoria's survival and her healthy infants stood as counterpoints, but they did not end the dispute. Instead, her use of chloroform became a symbol around which both sides rallied. As the years passed, stories of her confinements merged with the mythology of her reign. The Queen, who wore black in perpetual mourning for Albert, was also remembered as the woman who dared to breathe a forbidden vapor. This dual image unsettled the public imagination. A sovereign, both sternly moral and quietly subversive, embodying both tradition and defiance. It lent her an aura of mystery that blended seamlessly with the age's fascination for the occult and the scientific alike. The psychological weight of repeated pregnancies left its mark. Letters reveal her speaking of childbirth as a degradation, her language steeped in terms of horror and revulsion. Yet she fulfilled her duty with relentless regularity, as though bound by chains she could never break. Her resentment sometimes extended toward Albert himself, whom she accused of dragging her into the prison of maternity. The bitterness of those words coexisted with genuine affection, illustrating the contradictions that defined her inner life. In the broader political landscape, Victoria's fertility was celebrated as proof of dynastic stability. Christening was a public ceremony affirming continuity. Behind the ceremonial prayers, however, the Queen's personal anguish remained concealed. Ministers praised her as a model of domestic virtue, projecting her as the ideal wife and mother to a nation grappling with industrial unrest and colonial ambition. Yet the woman herself recoiled from the very role for which she was exalted. The irony was sharp. The mother of the nation privately detested motherhood itself. Whispers of chloroform, meanwhile, refused to fade. Theologians who had condemned it continued their crusade, warning congregations that to embrace such relief was to court damnation. And yet, among the upper classes, demand grew. The allure of a painless delivery proved stronger than the echo of Scripture. Physicians skilled in administering the drug found their services increasingly sought after. Slowly, the balance of opinion shifted, though never fully without resistance. Victoria's example was invoked on both sides. For advocates, she was the proof that anesthesia in childbirth was safe and dignified, a blessing even royalty accepted. For opponents, she was the embodiment of modern hubris, a sovereign too willing to place science above the decree of heaven. The paradox of her role only deepened with time. She neither campaigned for widespread use nor repented of her choice, leaving her legacy to be interpreted rather than declared. The empire over which she presided was itself a theater of contradictions. Industrial progress alongside urban squalor, evangelical fervor alongside scientific discovery, imperial confidence alongside colonial brutality. The story of her childbirths mirrored these tensions: pain and progress, tradition and innovation, faith and skepticism, all collided in those moments when chloroform's sweet, suffocating haze filled the royal chamber. By the late 1850s, medical literature had begun to record more systematic observations of chloroform, refining its use and mitigation some of its dangers. The initial shock of its adoption gave way to gradual acceptance, though not without casualties. Deaths still occurred, fueling debate, but the tide had turned. Victoria's discreet reliance on the drug had helped to normalize it, making it difficult for opponents to argue that it was wholly illegitimate. When the Queen of England herself had breathed its vapors and lived, how could it be dismissed outright? In the quiet moments after her confinements, she sometimes reflected on the gulf between her public image and her private despair. She cherished her children once they were born, yet never reconciled herself to the process that brought them into being. The palace became a stage where joy and horror played out in parallel. Laughter of infants in gilded nurseries, and behind closed doors, the lingering terror of a woman who knew she would one day face that torment again. The documents of the age, stained with ink and heavy with the rhetoric of morality, conceal as much as they reveal. They speak of divine will, of medical science, of royal duty. But in the spaces between the lines, one can almost hear the unrecorded sobs of a queen who felt betrayed by her own flesh. It is this tension, the sovereign commanding half the world, and the woman powerless before her womb, that grants the story its haunting power. As chloroform spread through hospitals and homes, the controversy diminished but never vanished. Even decades later, Some voices muttered that the practice remained unnatural. Yet, for countless women, the Queen's example offered justification to seek relief. The once forbidden vapor became a symbol of possibility, an opening through which the future of obstetrics marched. Behind it all lingered the shadow of Victoria's dread, a reminder that the path to progress is often paved by desperation as much as by vision. The narrative of her reign is usually told through the language of empire, maps expanding, fleets dominating, factories roaring. But hidden within that narrative lies the quieter, more human chronicle, the repeated cycle of fear, pain, and fleeting relief that shaped her private life. Her journals, her guarded comments, and the scandals whispered in drawing rooms remind us that history's great figures are never merely symbols. They bleed, they suffer, they resist, and sometimes they grasp at forbidden remedies to survive. Thus, the Queen who gave her name to an era also embodied its contradictions. The Victorian age was marked by both piety and progress, by rigid morality and daring innovation. In the Queen's use of chloroform, one sees the collision of these forces distilled into a single, intimate act. Whether she is judged as courageous or transgressive, her decision remains one of those rare moments when the veil of sovereignty lifts and we glimpse the raw human struggle beneath. Even now, the story resists a final verdict. Was Victoria the harbinger of modern medicine, or simply a frightened mother clutching at whatever respite she could find? Was her choice an act of faith in science, or a rebellion against divine ordinance? The answers remain unsettled, echoing in the silence of her diaries and the disputes of her contemporaries. What endures is the image of a monarch inhaling a sweet, suffocating vapor, surrendering not to agony, but to the uncertain promise of relief, and, in so doing, altering the history of childbirth forever. The years pressed forward, yet the memory of chloroform clung to Victoria like a secret seal upon her reign. Its vapor had eased her torment, but it had also opened a fissure between tradition and innovation that could not easily be closed. In the whispers of parlors and the debates of lecture halls, her name became entangled with a question that stretched far beyond the royal nursery. Could humanity, by the hand of science, truly defy the decrees of God? Theological voices rose with renewed urgency. From pulpits across Britain, preachers warned that the Queen herself had sinned against the natural order. They described the vapor as a sorcerer's trick, a devil's breath seducing women into believing they could escape the punishment decreed upon Eve. To them, childbirth was not only a biological process, but a ritual of obedience, the suffering of which reminded each generation of humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy. To dull that suffering was to reject submission and court divine wrath. Their sermons painted Victoria not as a mother of nations, but as a cautionary tale of pride. And yet, among the people, the resonance was different. Women who had endured the scream and agony of childbirth without relief found themselves questioning the necessity of pain. If the Queen could be spared, why not them? Stories spread of doctors who, emboldened by the royal precedent, offered chloroform discreetly to mothers who could afford it. In the drawing rooms of the elite, a new fashion emerged: whispered requests for the vapor, justified with a single phrase: "Her Majesty herself has used it." The monarchy, once the guardian of tradition, had inadvertently become a catalyst for change. Physicians, too, divided themselves into camps. Those of a cautious bent insisted that chloroform's dangers outweighed its benefits. They cited sudden deaths during surgeries, patients who failed to awaken, the mysterious collapse of hearts that had seemed strong. To them, the drug was a blade without a handle capable of cutting both ways. Yet others argued that refinement and careful measurement could make it safe. These men saw themselves as pioneers at the threshold of a new age, in which mercy would replace cruelty in the practice of medicine. Victoria's example provided their shield. No critic could easily condemn a method already sanctioned by the sovereign. Inside the palace, the Queen's own feelings remained conflicted. She continued to express disdain for pregnancy itself, calling it a degradation, a state unworthy of the dignity of a sovereign. She cherished her children once they were born, but the process of carrying and delivering them she regarded as a curse. Chloroform had not removed that curse, only softened its sting. Her journals betray both gratitude and resentment, as though the relief had come too late to erase the years of terror already etched into her mind. Prince Albert remained her anchor during these trials, urging moderation and discretion, encouraged her reliance on science, convinced that the future belonged not to superstition, but to reason. Yet his health, always fragile, began to falter in the late 1850s. As illness crept upon him, Victoria's dread of confinement was replaced by a deeper dread, the loss of the man she called her only friend and true companion. When he died in 1861, the Queen's world darkened into perpetual mourning. She withdrew from public life, her black garments becoming a shroud not only for her husband, but for her own vitality. In the shadow of Albert's death, the story of chloroform acquired a new resonance. To some, it symbolized the Queen's humanity, proof that even a monarch could falter and seek relief. To others, it became a footnote overshadowed by her widowhood, a curiosity in the larger tragedy of her reign. Yet in medical circles, the debate continued. Anesthesia advanced, techniques improved, and gradually, the once forbidden vapor became commonplace. Hospitals adopted it, midwives whispered of it, and by the latter half of the century, it was no longer scandalous for women to seek a less painful delivery. The Queen had not intended to lead a revolution, yet her private desperation had accelerated one. Still, the controversy never fully died. Some clung to the belief that pain was sacred, that to erase it was to tamper with the soul. Others argued that chloroform, though effective, was a blunt instrument, masking pain without addressing its causes. In the margins of medical reports, one sees the unease of a profession caught between tradition and progress, fearful of both God's judgment and the unpredictable nature of chemistry. Victoria's use of chloroform stood at the center of these anxieties, a reminder that the highest authority in the land had already chosen sides, even if she did so reluctantly. The psychological toll on the Queen deepened as she aged. She spoke less of chloroform and more of her loathing for childbirth, her bitterness toward the expectation, and that women, even sovereigns, should submit endlessly to the cycle of reproduction. Her daughters, too, would endure pregnancies of their own, spreading across Europe as consorts and queens. Some inherited their mother's dread, though none spoke of it so openly. The dynasty that Victoria established was built upon a foundation of births she herself had despised. The public, meanwhile, clung to the image of Victoria as the matronly mother of the empire. Paintings and engravings depicted her surrounded by children, a symbol of domestic virtue to a society that idealized family life. Few suspected the irony that the woman presented as the embodiment of motherhood recoiled from the very act of becoming a mother. The gulf between the image and the reality widened with each passing year, creating a myth that obscured the truth of her suffering. In the archives, however, the traces remain. Her words describe not only the relief of chloroform, but the fury she felt toward the endless demands of her body. She confided that she sometimes envied men who could govern without being chained to the cycles of conception and labor. These confessions lend her story a universal weight, for they echo the frustrations of countless women silenced by convention. Victoria's crown did not spare her from the burdens of her sex. It merely amplified the contradictions between her public duty and private despair. The religious outcry against chloroform, though it faded with time, left scars of its own. It revealed the deep fear that science might strip suffering of its meaning, that progress might rob faith of its authority. In accusing Victoria of defiance, her critics exposed their own anxieties about a world where machines, factories, and chemicals were reshaping existence. The Queen's choice in the birthing chamber became a symbol of that broader transformation, the collision of the old order with the new. As the empire expanded, carrying its banners to India, Africa, and beyond, the personal story of Victoria's childbirths became less visible, swallowed by narratives of conquest and progress. Yet the shadow lingered. Those who knew the details whispered of the Queen's secret reliance on chloroform, passing the tale as both scandal and inspiration. In households across Britain, the question was asked quietly, if the Queen need not suffer, why should we? By the 1870s, the controversy had shifted from whether anesthesia should be used to how it could be perfected. Surgeons refined their techniques, safer dosages were discovered, and new substances joined chloroform in the arsenal of medicine. The once heretical notion of a painless birth had become a legitimate goal of science. In that sense, the Queen's desperation had achieved what reformers and radicals might not. It had forced society to confront the possibility that pain was not sacred, but solvable. And yet, the Queen herself never embraced the role of pioneer. She remained silent in public, never championing chloroform as a cause. Her silence is telling. It suggests that for her, the vapor was not a banner of progress, but a private salvation, a way to endure what she could not escape. She did not seek to liberate others, only herself. That paradox lies at the heart of her legacy. She altered history without intending to, and in doing so, revealed the unpredictable ways in which private choices ripple outward into public consequence. The myth of Victoria as the grandmother of Europe rests upon the marriages of her children and grandchildren, who spread her lineage across royal houses. But behind that myth lies the hidden truth that each of those heirs was born in blood and tears that the Queen herself despised. Her reign, so often associated with stability and virtue, was haunted by the private specter of childbirth, a torment she endured 9 times and sought to dull with a forbidden vapor. That haunting presence gives her story a darker hue than the portraits and statues suggest. In the end, and chloroform did not free her from fear, nor did it erase the scars of her body or the bitterness of her words. What it did was to mark a turning point in the history of pain, a moment when the most exalted woman in the world whispered that suffering was not inevitable. Theologians may have condemned her, physicians may have debated her, but the memory of her relief lingered in the minds of women who dreamed of something more than agony. The story of chloroform in Victoria's life is not simply medical or theological. It is symbolic of an age wrestling with its own contradictions: faith and science, tradition and progress, duty and desire. In her chamber, gasping through the fumes that dulled her agony, Victoria became the vessel of that struggle. She bore not only a child, but the weight of a society deciding whether pain was sacred or expendable. That decision, though contested, would shape the path of medicine for generations. And so, her legacy carries with it a paradox. The Queen, who detested childbirth, became the most famous mother of the 19th century. The sovereign who clung to tradition in politics quietly embraced innovation in her most private moments. The woman who sought only relief for herself became, unwittingly, the catalyst for a revolution in obstetrics. Her story is not one of triumph or failure, but of contradiction, a tapestry woven of both agony and reprieve, secrecy and scandal, devotion and resentment. The archives preserve these contradictions without resolution. They offer glimpses but no final answers, hints of truth wrapped in layers of interpretation. To read them is to confront the mystery of a woman both exalted and tormented, a monarch both powerful and powerless. Victoria's story remains suspended between fact and myth, pain and progress, her breath of chloroform lingering like a ghost in the chambers of history. The twilight years of Victoria's reign were marked by an empire at its zenith, yet also by the shadows of her private life that refused to release their grip. The chloroform that had once transformed her confinements lingered as both salvation and stigma, a memory she carried with unease, even as the world around her accepted the practice she had made famous. By the 1870s, few questioned the use of anesthesia in surgery or childbirth, but the Queen herself remained haunted by the very experiences that had necessitated it. Albert's death had plunged her into mourning so profound that it seemed as though the very pulse of the monarchy had stopped. The black garb she adopted became not only the emblem of her widowhood, but the armor behind which she hid from the world. Ministers fretted, courtiers whispered, and the people, though loyal, grew uneasy with a sovereign who seldom appeared in public. In her solitude, she returned often to the recollections of her pregnancies and labors, as though, each memory were a wound reopened by grief. Without Albert, there was no one to temper her bitterness, no one to coax from her the faint acceptance she had once mustered. Her journals in these years reveal a tone sharpened by despair. She spoke of her body as ruined, her youth consumed by endless confinements, her soul scarred by the humiliations of childbirth. Chloroform had softened the pain, but it had not restored the dignity she felt stolen from her. Instead, it stood as a reminder of her desperation, a secret pact with science that she had never fully confessed to the world. Even as the practice became common, she could not bring herself to claim it openly. For her, it remained personal, intimate, and somehow tainted by the scandal it had once provoked. In the medical community, however, her example was celebrated. Physicians cited her case as proof that anesthesia could be used safely in the most delicate of circumstances. The Queen's survival and her healthy children's silence had many of the critics who had once thundered against chloroform. Medical journals shifted from condemnation to instruction, offering guidelines for dosage and administration. The practice spread across Europe and beyond, altering not only childbirth, but the entire philosophy of medicine. Pain was no longer seen as the inevitable companion of healing. It was an obstacle to be removed. This transformation, though owed to many hands, bore the invisible imprint of Victoria's breath within the palace chamber. Theologians, too, adjusted their stance. Some continued to insist that pain was divinely ordained, but others reinterpreted Scripture to accommodate compassion. They argued that while suffering was part of the human condition, the alleviation of it through skill and knowledge was itself a divine gift. This theological pivot allowed the faithful to embrace progress without feeling they had betrayed their beliefs. Yet the memory of the earlier condemnation lingered, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between faith and science remained. Victoria herself, though she lived to see this shift, remained ambivalent. She did not celebrate the acceptance of chloroform, nor did she repent of her choice. Her silence preserved the ambiguity of her role, leaving her image suspended between scandal and sainthood. Historians would later argue over her significance. Was she a pioneer of medical progress, or merely a frightened woman whose desperation happened to change history? The Queen's refusal to clarify the matter ensured that the question would remain unresolved. As her children grew and married into the royal houses of Europe, Victoria became the matriarch of dynasties. She was celebrated as the grandmother of Europe, her lineage spreading across borders, intertwining with crowns and thrones from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Yet behind the grandeur lay the irony that she had loathed the very process that had produced this web of heirs. The banquets and ceremonies that honored her descendants masked the private truth, that each child had been born in torment, and that the Queen had viewed the act of motherhood not as joy, but as duty inflicted upon her. This contradiction became more pronounced in her later years as she presided over jubilees celebrating the longevity of her reign. The public saw in her a symbol of stability, endurance, and maternal authority. The empire itself was likened to a family, with Victoria at its head, guiding her subjects as though they were children. Yet the Queen's own words, preserved in diaries and letters, painted a darker portrait. She did not revel in motherhood. She endured it. Her children were loved, but the path that brought them into being she regarded with dread. The maternal icon of the empire had despised the very essence of maternity. In the cultural imagination, however, her association with chloroform persisted. Writers and commentators invoked her name whenever debates over medical ethics arose. To some, she was proof that modern science could be reconciled with tradition. To others, she was evidence that even the highest could fall prey to weakness. This duality only deepened her mystique. Victoria the monarch was a figure of authority. Victoria the mother was a figure of contradiction. Together, they formed an image that was both reassuring and unsettling, both solid and shadowed. Her silence about chloroform also reflected a broader truth about her reign. She was a woman of intense private feeling, but rigid public reserve. She wept in solitude, raged in journals, confessed her dread in letters. But to her subjects, she presented only the mask of duty. That mask became her power, but it also became her prison. The contradiction between her inner life and outer image was never reconciled, and it is in that contradiction that her story gains its haunting quality. By the final decades of her life, anesthesia had become so common that few remembered the scandal it had once provoked. Surgeon eons used it routinely, women requested it without shame, and the idea of enduring needless agony was increasingly seen as barbaric. Yet the memory of the Queen's first inhalation of chloroform lingered as a pivotal moment. Without her, the practice might have taken longer to gain acceptance, its progress slowed by resistance. Her desperation had accelerated the future, even if she herself recoiled from acknowledging it. In the broader sweep of history, the tale of chloroform is but one thread in the tapestry of Victoria's reign. Yet it is a thread that reveals the humanity behind the crown. Empires rise and fall, but the cries of childbirth, the desperation for relief, the controversy over pain and faith, these belong to the eternal human story. In choosing chloroform, Victoria stepped out of the myth of monarchy and into the realm of ordinary women, sharing in their fear and their hope. That act of crossing, though cloaked in secrecy, forever altered the perception of what it meant to be both queen and mother. The final years of her life were spent in the shadow of her own legend. She was celebrated across continents, mourned by millions, enshrined in statues and portraits. Yet behind the marble and oil paint lies the memory of a woman who once whispered to herself that she could not endure another confinement. Her reign, stretching over 6 decades, encompassed wars, industrial revolutions, and imperial conquests. But it was also shaped by 9 moments of primal terror and relief. Each child carried within them the echoes of their mother's dread, and each generation carried forward the legacy of a queen who both defied and succumbed to her body. Thus, the story of Victoria's chloroform cannot be reduced to triumph or scandal alone. It is a story of contradictions unresolved, of faith challenged and science embraced, of suffering endured and relief seized. It is the story of a monarch who embodied the paradoxes of her age, modern yet traditional, maternal yet Rizal, F-U-L, powerful yet powerless. Her breath of chloroform was not merely a personal choice. It was a moment when the old world and the new collided in the body of a queen, leaving a legacy that continues to haunt the corridors of history. In the archives where her words remain, one can still sense the shadows that surrounded her. They speak not only of a sovereign, but of a woman trapped between roles, torn between duty and desire, caught in the relentless cycle of birth and death. The ink may have faded, but the anguish it records has not. It is there, waiting to be read, waiting to remind us that even the most exalted figures are bound by the same fears and frailties as those they govern. Her legacy endures not only in the empire that bore her name, but in the very nature of medicine itself. Each time a patient is spared agony through the use of anesthesia, a faint echo of Victoria's breath resounds. It is an echo of defiance, of desperation, of humanity's refusal to sanctify pain. It is the shadow of a queen who sought only to escape her own torment, and in doing so, altered the destiny of countless others. And so, in the final reckoning, Victoria remains both enigma and symbol. She is the matriarch who loathed maternity, the sovereign who embraced innovation yet clung to tradition, the widow who ruled an empire from behind a veil of black. Her story is not merely the story of a reign. It is the story of a struggle between body and spirit, faith and science, suffering and mercy. It is a story that does not end with her death, for its reverberations continue in every quiet chamber where pain is relieved by the breath of modern medicine. The winter of Victoria's life came heavy with silence, a silence broken only by the rituals of empire and the whispers of her children gathered across Europe's thrones. By the last years of the 19th century, The queen had lived long enough to see her likeness carved into marble, cast in bronze, and fixed in the minds of her subjects as a figure larger than mortality. Yet the truth remained. Behind the statues and ceremonies, she was a woman marked by scars invisible to the eye, scars carved by childbirth, grief, and the haunted memory of a forbidden vapor that had once delivered her from agony. The empire she presided over was vast, stretching across continents, its maps colored in red as if soaked in the blood of conquest. Railways and telegraphs stitched distant territories into the fabric of a single dominion. To the outside world, Victoria appeared the embodiment of stability and permanence. But in the private recesses of her life, she remained captive to the contradictions that had defined her from the beginning. The sovereign who commanded nations yet feared her own body, the matriarch who loathed maternity, the symbol of tradition who once embraced the most radical of medical innovations. Her children were grown, scattered across Europe, their marriages binding together dynasties in an intricate web of alliances and rivalries. They carried her blood into the courts of Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Madrid, and beyond. She was the grandmother of emperors and queens, her influence extending through family ties that both secured peace and sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The irony was sharp. Those heirs who now commanded armies and shaped nations had all emerged from the womb of a woman who had described childbirth as degradation, who had dreaded the very process that had secured their existence. As she aged, her journals grew quieter, but no less revealing. She seldom mentioned chloroform directly, as if unwilling to disturb the settled dust of controversy. Yet the memory of it lingered between her lines, a shadow beneath her reflections on duty and loss. She had felt its sweet suffocation twice, perhaps more, and it had transformed her perception of what was possible. For her, it had been a private salvation, never intended as a manifesto. But history does not wait for intent. History seizes upon moments, amplifies them, and weaves them into patterns that extend beyond the will of those who lived them. Victoria's breath of chloroform had already escaped her control. In the decades following its first use, anesthesia became commonplace. Surgeons refined their methods, chemists experimented with alternatives, and women across the empire began to expect what had once been unthinkable: relief from pain in childbirth. The fierce sermons of earlier years faded into the background, replaced by cautious acceptance and eventual silence. The very practice once denounced as defiance of God became a routine mercy, its origins in scandal forged, often by most. But those who remembered knew that the Queen had stood at the center of the storm, her desperation having forced society to reconsider the sanctity of suffering. Even as medical science advanced, the Queen herself never reconciled her public image with her private dread. She allowed herself to be celebrated as the mother of a dynasty, yet she left behind words that unmasked her loathing for the very act of motherhood. The paradox remained unresolved, and perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate. She embodied the contradictions of an age poised between faith and science, between the old order and the new. In her chambers, in the haze of chloroform, those contradictions converged in a single body, a single breath. When death finally approached in January of 1901, it came not with the agony of childbirth, but with the slow decline of age. She died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by children and grandchildren who would carry her blood into the turbulent century to come. Her passing marked the end of an era so vast it had given its name to the age itself. Yet even as nations mourned and black crape draped the streets of London, the shadow of her private struggles remained, woven into the hidden fabric of her legacy. In death, she was transformed into symbol. The widow in black became the embodiment of duty, sacrifice, and empire. Statues depicted her stern, unyielding, unbroken. The story of Chloroform faded into the background, overshadowed by the grandeur of jubilees and the enormity of her reign. Yet for those who look closer, who turn the fragile pages of her journals, or trace the whispered scandals of her time, the memory endures. It reminds us that beneath the marble mask was a woman who once trembled at the prospect of labor, who once clutched at the mercy of science to escape the torment ordained by tradition. The historians who followed have struggled to capture her essence. Some paint her as a tyrant of domesticity, imposing her will upon her family and her ministers with unyielding authority. Others portray her as a victim of circumstance, a woman burdened by expectations she despised. The truth lies in neither extreme, but in the tension between them. She was both sovereign and sufferer, both matriarch and rebel, both guardian of tradition and reluctant pioneer. Her life was a mirror of the contradictions of her age, and it is in those contradictions that her story finds its haunting power. The legacy of Chloroform in her life is more than medical. It is symbolic of a deeper transformation, the shift from a world where suffering was sanctified to a world where suffering could be challenged. Victoria did not intend to lead that transformation, but her breath within the chamber made it unavoidable. By seeking relief for herself, she opened a path for countless others. By choosing to silence her cries with vapor, she gave voice to a question that would echo long after her death. Must pain always be endured, or can it be defied? As the 20th century dawned, the empire she had nurtured began to show cracks. The alliances woven by her children would unravel into war, the grandeur of her jubilees giving way to the trenches of 1914. Yet even in the chaos that followed, her image remained, cast in bronze, carved in stone, preserved in memory. And within that image, hidden from those who saw only the stern gaze of a queen, lies the secret of Chloroform, the whisper of a woman who dared to defy the curse of pain, if only for a moment. To read her story is to open a file that is at once public and private, majestic and intimate, triumphant and tragic. It is to see how the choices of one woman, made in the secrecy of her chamber, reverberated through history. It is to confront the paradox of a queen who shaped the world, yet could not shape her own body. It is to hear, in the silence of the archives, the echo of a breath taken against the will of tradition. A breath that changed medicine, altered faith, and revealed the frailty hidden within power. The shadow of Victoria endures not only in monuments and history books, but in the simple act of mercy repeated in hospitals every day. Each time a mother is spared agony through the touch of anesthesia, the echo of that shadow stirs. It is the echo of a queen who sought only to survive her own duty, who found relief in forbidden vapor, and who left behind a legacy written not only in empire, but in the very nature of human suffering and its defiance. And so the tale concludes, not with resolution but with resonance. For the story of Victoria and Chloroform is not a closed chapter but an open question. It asks us to consider the weight of suffering, the authority of faith, the power of science, and the fragile humanity hidden within even the mightiest of rulers. It reminds us that history is not only the story of nations but of bodies, not only of crowns but of cries, not only of empires, but of the intimate struggles that shape them. The queen is gone, but the shadow remains. It lingers in the breath of chloroform, in the silence of the archives, in the paradox of her legacy. It reminds us that, beneath the grandeur of the Victorian age, lies the haunting truth of a woman who feared her own flesh, and yet, by that fear, altered the fate of countless others. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.